Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Breaking Boundaries. In today's episode, we will be featuring Sara Saihati. Sara comes from a very interesting background. Both her parents come from different cultures. Her father from Saudi Arabia and her mom from America. And we talked through how that has shaped her moral structure and her fabric and her philosophies. Prior to joining tech recently, she spent over 10 years in upstream oil and gas, and 6.5 years out of those 10 years mostly were in the field on rig sites where she was the only woman on the site. This obviously has brought a huge amount of perspective around being the only one in the room and having to build a career where a series of firsts where she effectively is now a role model for others in the industry. Sara is now the chair of events committee at the Colorado Technology Association Young Professionals Board, and I'm very proud and honored to have her as a guest on this show. Without further ado, Sara Saihati.
First of all, thank you, Sara, for making the time to join me today, to be my guest. I know we've tried to schedule this 4 times now. And we finally are getting to actually recording.
It's been a long time coming, but I'm glad we're here.
Yes, so. Exactly. But for everybody who's going to be listening or watching this on YouTube, Sara and I have been talking for almost 6 months at this point about potentially doing this podcast episode together. And I'm really excited to bring a very different perspective on diversity, inclusion, and a journey for a woman in tech to all of you. So I'm going to start off with where it all started, your family, which is you come from a bicultural family. And that in itself is very unique. And I'd love for you to talk to us about your family, your upbringing, and the moral structure and the fabric of the philosophy that it all brought into making Sara today.
Okay, so I am half Saudi, half American. I spent half my life in the States and then half my life in Saudi. I always hate the question, where are you from? Because the answer is everywhere at this point. But I'm specifically from the town of Saihati, which is this small little town on the eastern coast that my family founded 1,000 years ago. So
very nice. Cool.
And like a lot of families there, they're big and tribal, and I've got 100 cousins and, 20, 30 aunties and uncles that I grew up with, and all my relatives were my neighbors. So, you get a baked in friendship circle where your family is also your friends. And then I moved to the States, and it was a huge culture shock because I didn't really know how to make friends, because when you have a baked-in family that happens to be your friends, you don't really have those skill sets to go out and make friends. And, my family in the States, I've got 1 uncle and 2 cousins, and that's it. So compared to the 50, 100, whatever, unknown number, in Saudi, so it's quite different. And then, I'm one of 7. So my,
sisters, all sisters?
Sisters and brothers. So my mom was married before she got with my dad. And so I have 2 older half sisters that are 100% American. And then, I've got my older brother and younger brother. And so I grew up with brothers. So I have all these sisters, and I didn't grow up with any of them. And then my parents divorced and my dad remarried, and I have 2 little sisters that I'm 18 and 22 years older than. So I have 4 sisters. Didn't grow up with any of them. Grew up with my brothers.
So I can totally relate to crazy family sizes, because my dad's side back in India, he was one of 13 siblings.
Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah.
So basically, when you had a family gathering, it was 100 people. Mm-hmm. And I felt like everybody needed name tags.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, is there a guide that goes with "You are related to me, how again?"
Yes.
And that's how it felt. But yeah, crazy
Well,
sized families.
well, it's also funny explaining it to my American husband, because he's like, "And how are they related to you?" And I'm like, "Ooh, let me pull out the family tree."
Yeah,
So,
it's scary. Scary.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah, Indian families. I'm Indian, so
same.
Indian families are very similar.
Yep.
Large families. Now, so I mean, you talked about friendships and creating friends and creating a social circle. What else was ingrained into you? I'll seed something here. For me, growing up in India, it was, and I say this even in some other episodes that I've recorded, is I had three choices in my generation. It was you're an engineer, you're a doctor, or you're a loser, right? There was like this dramatic tail off at the end of those two. So, I mean, thoughts around that and the pressures around all of that too.
Yeah, okay, so I would say, similar for me. Women 20 years ago, 30 years ago didn't have a whole lot of career options in Saudi. I would say the two options that were presented to me were become a teacher or become a doctor. And, my dad's an engineer, but he always wanted to be a doctor. And so he was always trying to push us into becoming doctors, and none of us wanted to be doctors. We all became engineers. And for me, it was an unusual case because, I decided at 13 that I wanted to pursue chemical engineering. Because my friend's dad worked for Saudi Aramco and he was a project manager, and they'd travel to a country and work on a project for 2 years and then go back to Saudi for 2 years. And I just thought that kind of lifestyle was really, really cool. So I was like, all right, I'll pursue chemical engineering, and then I can be a project manager and I can have that kind of lifestyle. That's not necessarily how it played out for me, but I did pursue chemical engineering. And when I would talk to family, I would get this kind of pushback like, yeah, but like, what are you gonna do? How are you gonna have a job? And I would say, oh, well, I could work for Aramco. They hire women engineers.
Yeah.
And the answer was, I don't know. Maybe not. And, so I pursued engineering anyways. And, one of my cousins, she also pursued engineering as well, chemical engineering as well. And she works for Saudi Aramco. So it worked out. It's just one of those things where, no one had seen it. And so the possibility of it just seemed absurd. But we did it anyway.
Talk to me more. That is a very loaded statement, right? Nobody'd seen it.
Yeah.
So, they didn't know that it was even an option, right? So now, effectively, you're going in and creating more Saras, right? Because now they have a role model. They know it's been done before, women in engineering, etc., right? How does that feel in terms of just like breaking the monolith, breaking that boundary there too?
I think it's never as fast as I want it to be. I don't think I was even the first because my cousin pursued engineering at the same time I did. And we came about those decisions completely separately. It's not like we talked about it and it was like, hey, I want to be a chemical engineer. Yeah. Oh, do you want to be a chemical engineer? You should be a chemical engineer too. And we can do it together. It was completely separate. That, we both like chemistry.
Yeah.
And we were both like, how do we apply chemistry? And, she got on with Saudi Aramco, and by that point I had moved to the States, and pursued my engineering degree here. And she did as well. She came to the U.S. to study chemical engineering. She's gone off and gotten her PhD in chemistry, so she's above and beyond me at this point. But there were no engineering programs for women in Saudi. There was King Fahd University of Petroleum Engineering, which was the engineering university in the country, and I want to say up until last year it wasn't open to women. So if you wanted to pursue engineering as a woman, you had to leave the country. So it's not that the jobs didn't exist; it's that in order to get the job, you actually lived there.
So is that why you moved here during freshman year?
Yeah, I mean, my parents went through a divorce, and so I consciously knew that I would have, as far as like pursuing STEM, I would have more limited avenues if I stayed in Saudi outside of pursuing medical.
So this is a matter of time.
Mm-hmm. So I just knew it would be easier if I came to the States for it. And so I did.
No,
high school and college in the States. Been here ever since.
Well, curious. You said now women can now go to university in Saudi Arabia now as of last year. Like, very curious to see if there's any avenues to go, maybe mentor some of them into STEM as well, like remotely, right? Because I'm guessing that could be something that maybe some listeners would be interested in doing as well.
I mean, if there's someone that wants to talk to me about it, I'm more than happy to. As far as formal mentorship programs, I don't know of any. But I do know a fair amount of women who wound up being field engineers and have become the first field engineer on a rig site in Saudi. So I know that they are doing a lot of community outreach there.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah. But I have not personally been approached by any, but I do.
Okay. You talked about the first woman engineer on oil rig, so maybe a good pivot point to talk through your experience in oil and gas as an industry, coming through that, and quote unquote from our last conversation, you've never had a woman and you'll be the first.
Yes. I don't want to cast doubt on companies that go out there and say that, but if a company is approaching you and saying, hey, you'll be the first minority whatever to pursue XYZ, know that you will be alone in that pursuit. So I spent 10 years in oil and gas, and 6.5 of those was doing field operations in U.S. land. So I've worked in Rock Springs, Wyoming, the Pinedale location, all the way down to South Texas, Eagle Ford. I've done stints in Midland, Texas. I've worked in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Hobbs, New Mexico. The only place I haven't worked in the U.S. is in the Gulf, and like the U.S. Gulf, not the Saudi Gulf, and Alaska and California. Those are the only 3 places I haven't worked in oil and gas. And I was almost always the first. So I typically was the first woman that anyone had ever worked with. So there was a lot of preconceived notions about like, oh, I have a female coworker. Mm-hmm. I've never had that before, which is interesting and bizarre at the same time, especially in America. And then also, I was always the first Arab or the first Muslim woman that they had ever met or known on a personal level. Okay. So it was kind of like this interesting thing. I felt I've always been the first. And then as I continued on in my career, the first company I worked for, they had, like, I had a couple female coworkers, but the work itself was very individual. So even though there were a couple female counterparts in the office, we all went off into the rigs, or onto locations, and we're the only. And then my second company that I worked for, same thing. There were a couple other women in the office, but when you go out to a rig site, it's usually just you and 50 other grows. And you gotta learn to play nice with people, so. Yeah, and then, even when I moved into the office and I was an ops supervisor, I was the first woman in North America. When I went into technical sales for my business unit, I was the first and only woman with that job role in technical sales for all of North America. And that's not to say that other business units didn't have women. Other business units did have women.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's pursuing your own individual little path where you're kind of in a bubble. You don't really get to interact with others. It's very different.
Question for you there is, there's a ton of firsts in what you just said.
Yeah.
First of all, let me just make that statement. So, did you find yourselves fatigued because you're breaking stereotypes constantly, right? So, like you walk into a room and they have the stereotypical view of what an Arab woman, Muslim should be, and you're potentially not that, you're outside that box, and effectively breaking that stereotype and getting what I would call, no offense to anybody who's listening, stupid questions a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So,
yeah.
You want to just double click on that and talk through that?
Sure. I'm very racially ambiguous looking. And so, is she a quarter black, half black? Is she Hispanic? What is she? So that was usually one of the first questions was, what are you? And they would ask it just like that, like, what are you? And I'm like, I'm a person. Who are you? And so sometimes I would play these little word games, like, what do you mean? And I'd be like, well, where are your parents from? And I'd be like, oh, my mom's from Kentucky. And I'd be like, oh, where's her mom from? Or, where's her family from? And I'm like, oh, Tennessee. Like, my granddad was a coal mining engineer and worked in the coal mine. My grandpappy was a coal miner. And, you just see the continuous look of confusion on their face. Before I'm like, yeah, my dad's Saudi. That explains the confusion. So yeah, I'd say that's like one of the questions, I get asked. I get asked about like covering or not covering my hair. I get asked about like, oh, are you actually Muslim? And I'm like, yes, I am. And then, I'd get asked like, well, what's with the crazy terrorists? So, media bias type questions. And I'd be like, I don't know, tell me about like the white cultists.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's one of those things where I learned not to dive into questions where it was people, asking to prove their own biases. There's people who ask questions because they're genuinely curious and they want to know and they want to educate themselves. And then there's people who are looking to confirm their biases. And I got really good at being able to figure out between those two. And if someone was really authentic and wanted to know more, then I would answer the question. And if not, I would just deflect and be like, hey, I gotta go do something over here. I'll talk to you later.
So I loved everything you just said, just because, any religion you take can be polarized.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I'm born and raised Hindu, but I know that can be polarized too, for the number of gods we have in Hinduism. So, I completely agree. And the other thing is, I loved the answer also there around, I'm not trying to like confirm bias. And I think at least for listeners that's important, that if you're different in some way, make sure that the answer is articulate enough not to confirm bias more than anything else.
Well, it's like I would get asked the question a fair amount, what place is better? You're obviously happier here, right? Your life is obviously better here, comparative. And I would say my answer has always been growing up. There's good and bad in everything. There's great things like the familial bound culture, the friendliness, the free healthcare, you know, and then in
Loaded
America,
statements
it's
for
like,
today.
yeah, and then here in America, I mean, it's the land of possibility, right? Like I can go out and do things that I would be limited in being able to do. So I mean, there's good and bad in every place, and the point is to focus on the good, right? So,
A slight change in terms of tone here. Whenever we say diversity, it's a good thing, but it also tends to be a point to usually marginalize good talent. I've seen. Case in point, I've heard the term diversity hire.
Yeah.
They hired, let's say they hired a woman, they'd say, oh, there's a big push to like fix diversity, so they're just hiring and moving on. Now, while I cannot validate the truth of that statement, I can definitely validate one thing, which is good talent gets lost in that statement.
Yes.
And that's irrespective of whether you think of it as diversity or any other lens you look at it. So, for you, being the first in so many things that we talked about, right? How did that affect you, right? I mean, I'm guessing there's some level of, I'm talking about all the words that nobody wants to touch right now, which is nepotism, sexism.
All the isms.
Right? Marginalization, all of that, right? Things that you see in corporate America that nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole. I'm going to open that can of worms.
Okay, well, I've lived them all, so, so I would say, yes. I have done university recruiting. I have done recruitment for D&I initiatives. I've seen the good and bad of it. Like you said, a good candidate's a good candidate is a good candidate, right? They fit the culture, they'll do the job well, they'll stick around.
Yeah.
The problem that I have seen is, coming out and saying, oh, we need to hire diversity at 20%. And diversity is code for women. It's not true diversity. And I take issue with that, because you need diversity of thought. And sometimes that diversity of women happens to be strictly white women from a socioeconomic background, and you're really not getting the diversity or breadth of women or diversity at large. So that will get lost in the shuffle as well. Also, if you're hiring the wrong candidates because of a demographic that you're stuck on, like for instance with the hiring of women, like, hey, we need to hit this 20% metric, we're gonna hire at 20%, awesome, but you're just allowing any and every woman, good or bad, as a candidate into the organization, they're not going to stick around. And they will make it harder for the other minority groups. I know that I've personally experienced that showing up on a rig where, they happened to have another woman that was out there for like a week, and the mentality that I've gotten is, oh yeah, they can't hack it. I'm like, okay, I don't know. You tell me as the only guy walking into an isolated location in the middle of nowhere with 50 other women, and you tell me like what hostility you encounter.
I'll give you a little story here if you want.
Yeah, sure, right? Sure.
So, in 2016 or 17, I'd like to say 2017. Earlier in my D&I, let's just say, learning phase, I was trying to just go do more to learn more. I attended Watermark Conference for women in the Bay Area. 10,000 women showed up. 3 men showed up. one of them being me. And oh my freaking God, I was scared shitless. Is maybe what I would say. And pardon the French here, but oh my God, it was scary. I remember I was like, that was exhausting. Intimidating. And I said this to some others, and they were like, for you? And I was like, yes, for me. It was intimidating. I was like, as confident as I am and as accomplished as I am, it was still intimidating, right? Because I was the odd one out, and there was nothing inside that looked like me, spoke like me, that I could relate to, that I knew. And I remember coming out of one of the halls, and I just waited by the doors for everybody to leave. And one of my coworkers, she literally grabbed me by the hand, just locked me in the hand. She's like, come with me, just walk with me, right? And she did one of these ally moments, right? She was like, I know you're scared, let me grab you. And she walked with me, and she literally walked me out of the hall into the main area, and then we sat down and we were talking and everything. But if not for that person who pulled me in and did that, I would have still been like, oh my God, like, this is scary, right?
Yeah.
But it was there. I can totally relate.
Okay, so I'm really curious about this as well. How much mental energy in those moments did you put towards, oh my gosh, how am I going to be perceived by being here in this room? What are other people thinking of me or making assumptions about me?
80% of my energy, I would say.
Yeah.
Give or take.
Yeah.
And I would say the fatigue is still true to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the mental load, right?
Yeah.
So, whenever I had to go out to a rig, especially if it was a new rig with people that didn't know me, didn't know my work ethic, anything of that nature, I would have to consciously think of how am I going to present myself? I am 5'1". I am a very tiny person. So from a height standpoint, me showing up on a rig with my steel toe boots and hard hat, I had a lot of jokes about like, be careful, it's supposed to snow, Sarah might get lost, be on the lookout that she doesn't get swept away. So, there's that, there's the mentality of like, what is she? Is she one of us or do we other her? And then there was is she a diversity hire versus does she actually know what she's talking about? And so I kind of always had this script, when I would meet, guys on the rig or engineers or whoever that would highlight my experience and my knowledge so that within the first 5 minutes they're like, oh, okay, she's not an idiot.
Yeah.
And she can be trusted to a certain degree. Let's see how this plays out, or at least like give her a shot.
Yeah. Totally.
But there's a lot of mental energy that goes into that, to having to be on guard and prepare for that. So I would casually mention like, oh, where have you worked? What oil and gas basins have you worked at? Oh, I've worked there. When were you there? Oh, I was there, 5 years ago. And then it's like, oh, well, if she was there 5 years ago, that means she's got 5 years of experience. And, she's familiar and she knows what I'm talking about when I say it. So having to do these mental gymnastics for them.
So I did not prepare for any of that mental gymnastics before I walked into Watermark. So it was completely like fish out of water. But I will tell you the turning point in terms of like my journey here is, I told you it was a stranger. So I stepped away to go use the restroom, and it literally felt like the entire 10,000 were staring at me because I was a really dude like walking away. And I was like, oh my god, like there's this, oh my god, in my head running. And one of the ladies sitting in one of the tables just high-fived me. She's like, you get it.
Yeah.
right?
Welcome to our world.
And I was like, really? And I was like, that moment, and maybe it was at that point the hamster maybe was running at like 9,000 miles an hour. Prior to that, it dropped down to like 100 miles an hour. I was like, okay, fine, okay,
Yeah,
you're doing the right thing. You just needed that moment of validation to say, okay, you're in the right place. You're ahead of the crew.
Yeah,
right. It's okay. This is going to be normal.
I've literally had so you've got like the main group of people that work on a rig and they're there all the time, and then you have casing crew that come out and they're only responsible for casing, so they're only there for like a couple days. But those crew, because they weren't used to seeing me, I'd literally be out there, walking the rig to do my job, do my circuit, and they would stop and point and be like, oh, there's a woman. Look at her. Are you seeing this? And they'd point, alien. And I would be like, hey, why are you pointing at me? Please stop. That's my thing.
That's wrong and funny at the same time.
It's wrong and funny at the same time. Honestly, I kind of attribute it to like prison rules, like you've just never seen, you get so acclimated to not seeing someone of the opposite sex that when you see one, you're just like, whoa, a unicorn. So.
Yeah. So. I don't even know how I can recover from that one. Like, that's going to be running in my head. It's like, unicorn!
Unicorn! I mean, shoot, my husband, he's a physical therapist assistant. He's like, usually the only or like one of two men in his office. So he gets to be the unicorn sometimes, which is fun in reverse.
It's funny you mentioned that. But I think one thing I do want to get out of the whole conversation is there's fatigue involved, being the only.
Yes.
There's also fatigue involved supporting the only.
Yes.
Right? Like, because for the allies on the call who are going to listen to this, I deal with copious amounts of people who come and ask me questions which are like, really, do I have to like justify this? Why do you do more D&I work? Is a question I have gotten.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, I have to, I'm brown, dude. Like, I'm Indian. Like, I don't know what to explain to you. Like, why would I do more diversity and inclusion work? Because it's part of identity. It's kind of how I am. I'm trying to create more space for other cultures to flourish as well, and other people from different backgrounds. It has nothing to do with just me. It's me as in beyond me. Like, how do we have
the collective?
The collective of the society, a good representation of society. And recently somebody had asked me, and I'd love your feedback on this, is how do you define inclusion and how do you define diversity, and like, have you reached it? And I said, well, if I was to say end state is when there's parity between the society I live in its representation, and my workplace. And that could be different in each and every location.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm in the Bay Area, which means it's the United Colors of Benetton is going to be in my office. And if it's not, then, hey, there's room for growth.
Yeah. It's interesting because I would say sometimes people have blind spots on it. It's that whole like, hey, it's 2021. Like, this is no longer an issue. Like, why are we still fighting about this? But I mean, I recently was on a call with colleagues where it was talking about like diversity and inclusion initiatives and how do you guys feel about it? Are we doing a good job? Are we not doing a good job? What can we improve? Things of that nature. And one of my colleagues was saying something along the lines of like, oh well, I feel I've been with the company for like 10 years. I feel like we've always done a good job. Like it's we just need to keep doing what we're doing. But, I was on the call and there was about 10 of us and I was like, okay, there's 3 women and then everybody's white and then I'm racially ambiguous. So, like, there's no black men on the call, there's no Asians, there's no, there's no Indians, there's no, there's no poor people, there's no people from wealthy backgrounds, there's no general middle class, there's no people from Omaha versus New York City.
Yeah.
And, I probably should have said something, but like, I didn't want to kill his vibe. I'm like, really, dude? Like, do you not see this Zoom call with like 10 faces and all of them are white? Like, and 3 women? So, it's one of those things like, okay, we're doing a good job, but we could do better. Like, yeah. Gotta keep fighting.
Shifting gears a little bit, you're doing a lot of work with CTA.
Yes.
Right. Would love for you to talk through what CTA is all about, what you're doing there, and what works there on the D&I space as well. Mm-hmm. And then pivot to maybe a couple of closing questions right after that. One which is around allyship as well.
Yes.
So.
Okay. So Colorado Tech Association, I got involved with them last year when I hired on with Arrow. It was my first foray into the tech space. As I mentioned, I did technical sales, and then Arrow is trying to grow their engineering solutions business unit. And so I'm now a salesperson for Arrow.
Welcome to sales.
Thank you. It's been a ride.
It doesn't get any better.
Yeah.
It's a crazy ride. You're either built for it or you're not.
Oh, God, fingers crossed. I hope I'm built for it. So I heard that Arrow is a sponsor for the Colorado Tech Association, so I was like, this must be a cool place to hang out if Arrow's spending time on it, to be involved with it. And so I reached out to them and made friends with the people that actually work for the organization, and they were telling me about how they were looking to launch a young professionals board to help increase the tech talent pipeline of young people. Tech talent pipeline, or any talent pipeline, is an issue in every industry across the board. Right? And so I said, sure, great. I have ideas. I have all sorts of unsolicited advice. So I got put on the board. I am the chair of the event committee, and we are looking at mapping out events for the next 18 months. And my goal is to have 2 professional development events, 2 social events, and then 2 community service events. And part of that is, how do we increase the diversity of the talent that is drawn into the tech space? As I mentioned, one of the issues that I've seen companies do is they set metrics like, hey, let's hire at 20%. But lo and behold, the attrition rate by the time they're 2 years in is back down to 5%, which means that, hey, you don't have a culture that keeps people. Yeah. So how do we bring people in? How do we lure the unsuspecting youths? And then how do we make it so that it's a welcoming environment that they want to stay? I'm sure you encounter this. I used to do a lot of university recruiting for my previous employer. I love talking to high schoolers and college kids because they have so much youthful enthusiasm. They haven't been beat down by life. Life hasn't punched them in the face yet. But part of that is that they have so much joyful optimism and ideas on how to make the world better and how to make work better.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, hey, part of diversity, let's have diversity in ages, right? You've got your people with 20, 30 years of experience. It is valuable experience. And then you have new people who have different opinions on how things should be done, and that's diversity in and of itself. Yeah. So to me, it's like, how do we combine that? CTA tends to have, I don't want to say an older demographic, but kind of a more established demographic. And a lot of people find their way into tech by accident, kind of like me. And it's like, well, how do we make those accidents an actual pipeline?
Yeah.
So those are the things that I'm kind of working on, that I think about for CTA.
How can listeners or people who are watching this help you with that?
Okay. I would say check out the Colorado Technology Association.org. Look us up on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. And I will help route you and get you signed up. They have awesome sessions. They do, women in tech, webinars and, on a monthly basis. They have an annual, Women in Tech conference that we just had a couple weeks ago. I was a co-host for one of their follow-up events yesterday that was about, women in tech and, diversity of ages, what they're doing. Rising stars and established members of the community. Find ways to volunteer and get involved. If you have ideas, to share them with me because we're in the middle of creating this young professionals group.
Awesome. No, we should be doing more of that. Completely agree. Thank you for doing that. My last question for today is going to be around allyship.
Yes.
I tend to close with this a lot because we're trying to create a safe space for allies to learn when they listen to these sessions as well. What are 3 things allies should do more of, right, while we really try to shift the landscape to make it more inclusive?
I'd say call out the BS when we're not in the room.
Okay.
That's a big one. I feel like a lot of people talk about D&I and the importance of diversity in the workplace in a public setting or in front of Wall Street or in front of investors, or even in front of their employees. And then behind closed doors, it's like, we'll see what happens, right? We'll see what sticks. Yeah. I would say if you're an ally in a position of power, creating and establishing real metrics with consequences. So for instance, going back to that 20% example, right? My boss, one of my old bosses, he was asking me like, hey, what do women want from you? What do you need that's so different? And he was telling me that, management told him that he has to hire diversity, as in women, and that for the past 5 quarters, he hasn't been able to hire anybody. And that there really was no consequence to that, right? So there's that aspect of it where it's like, hey, let's talk about it, but then let's not make it important enough to have action items. So I would say if you're in a position of power and you have a team beneath you and it's something that you want to accomplish, that you have to have metrics around it. You have to set smart goals. Yeah. And then also, be conscious of your culture. Some people have rose-colored glasses about their culture and their work environment. And I don't think it's malicious. I just think it's, it's just unconscious bias or just ignorance, right? Sometimes people aren't aware of things until it punches them in the face. Like they're not aware that, hey, Joe, who runs the meeting, always silences Cecilia. But being someone in the room who then turns around and says, yeah, that was a really good point that Cecilia made. I'd like to hear more about her. Or whatever it is that she had to say. So, I mean, more of those little day-to-day things, because a lot of the issue of being a minority, whatever type of minority, is that death by 100 paper cuts. It's these little microaggressions day in and day out that really wear us down. So, those 3 things. I'd say this.
Yeah, so, summarizing to some extent, hopefully I didn't miss them, is like, call out the BS, number 1. Right? Number 2, create consequences so that diversity is not just a check mark, it's more of a action integrated process, right? It's like you're creating sustained change. 3, I would actually state as, don't be a bystander, be an upstander. And if you see something, call it out, make sure that the microaggressions get called out on a day-to-day basis.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Thank you for summarizing. I kind of get wordy.
No. Because I want people listening also to like take that away when they're listening to this. No, this is phenomenal. I love the chat. And for everybody listening, till about 60 minutes ago, we were on two minds whether we should record today or not. So
yeah. I'm glad we did.
And I'm glad we did. So this has been a great session. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, to join us today. But yes, it's been an honor having you on our show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for valuing, I guess, my experiences and what I have to say about it. Like I said, I'm full of unsolicited opinions on things. So it's nice to be able to get them out there.
No, I think from a relatability standpoint, for everybody listening, for me, there's so many parallels between what you said and what I've been through on a day-to-day basis, and I'm guessing there's a healthy percentage of us out there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
You're welcome.